Welcome to the Mesozoic evolution of North America. It looked like it needed to be said like that. I don't know what to say. I think I'm going senile sitting here on the floor of my home. Okay, so starting in the Triassic period, we have Pangea, that begins to break up as we get into the Jurassic, and then further it breaks up as we get into the Cretaceous. Now, so what we'll talk about in subsequent sections are more so the regions in which these changes were occurring. So what kind of changes were there? So there was still the same kind of tectonism and sedimentation as in the Paleozoic. Tectonic plates moving around the same speed, weathering and erosion occurring, sedimentation, deposition, all of that very similar to the Paleozoic in speed and frequency. There was a little bit more terrestrial sedimentation and deposition over much of the Craton because, as it turns out, there was less transgressive, regressive events during the Mesozoic. There's less oceans covering the North American Craton. On the East Coast in the Appalachian region, igneous activity and faulting began to occur as Pangea was breaking up. Down in the Gulf of Mexico, that was forming, and then extensive evaporate depositions were occurring. Worldwide, there was still transgressions and regressions occurring, but a lot of that occurrence in North America really more so hit out in the west in the Cordilleran. Volcanic island arcs were kind of added on to the western edge of North America, creating on those volcanic arcs and terrains to cause uplift and mountain creation, as in the Sonoma orogeny. And then the Cordilleran area was involved again in a series of major mountain building episodes, and the mountains that we now know that occurred during this time would be things like the Sierra Nevada mountains in eastern California and the modern day Rocky Mountains. So when we're talking about Paleozoic era geologic history, we kind of talked about it from an unconformity-bound sequence, transgression, regression look, focusing on the movement of the Pyrrhic seas, again, these transgressions and regressive events and these sequences. We talked about 4 sequences of these transgression, regression events in North America. That's kind of how we left the conversation of the Paleozoic, as well as a little bit on the Appalachian orogeny. However, these types of transgressive, regressive events, they were not as important during the Mesozoic. We still had some. Worldwide they occurred. North America they occurred in some parts, but not as extensive as they occurred during the Paleozoic. So keeping that in mind, we will examine the Mesozoic more so in a regional aspect than kind of in order of a certain sequence of transgressive, regressive events. So we'll just say, hey, on the East Coast, this is what happened. On the West Coast, on the Gulf Coast, in the middle of the continent. So we'll have more of that conversation than kind of trying to keep it in sequence, because again, these transgressive, regressive events, they just weren't as important in the Mesozoic. If you recall, this is what I'm talking about. We talked about the Sauk and Tippecanoe, Kaskaskia, and Absaroka sequences, and then the Appalachian orogenic events. Even though there are these sequences, we have the Zuni sequence that spans the Jurassic and Cretaceous, and then even in the Cenozoic we have the Tejas sequence, but again, they just weren't as widespread. They didn't have as big of an impact. They had some impact, but not as big as what we saw in the Paleozoic. So again, in terms of, or keeping that in mind, we'll talk about geologic history, but based on regions. This was happening here, this was happening there, instead of these big sequence events. for the most part. The only part where we'll pretty much talk about sequences again a little bit will be in the next section, section 4, when we talk about what was going on in the continental interior. We'll pause here. I'll see you back here in just a second.